Now today we have a far larger program, but I'd like to introduce a couple of people who've made today possible. And thank you, Chris. First would be Dory Meyer. Dory, where are you? Dory, stand up.
Oh.
Dory has been sort of responsible for putting all of Forever Saroyan together into a website. We had a dream in the beginning when we ended up with the archive that we now have of doing a museum, a Saroyan museum somewhere, but that proved to be impossible from a cost standpoint as well as a long-term project. How were people going to see this thing? Where were they going to come from? Who was going to pay for it? And costs were just out of the question. So we said, well, we're going to do a virtual museum. We're going to put everything we have in a website and make people come to that from any part of the world and learn everything they want to know about William Saroyan from what we have in our archive. Whether it be his paintings, his early poetry, his songs, his novels, his letters to every magnificent writer of the time, we wanted to make those all available. So we started to do that, and Dory was responsible for the basic construction of all of that. In addition, Dory has been publishing, literally weekly, a piece she does called Place of Places, which is from Saroyan's book, The Place of Places. These are all places he's lived in, and stories that are magnificent. And these things are viewed all over the world. People who have traveled to these places will recognize the addresses, will recognize the times. And Dory goes behind the scenes and develops a whole story about it. So it's not only Saroyan's experience there, but it's the experience of being in that particular city at that particular time. And in fact, I had a nice exchange with a cousin from Fresno who had just seen one of Dory's pieces on Fresno, and he said, you know something, I'm learning more about Fresno reading Dory's work than I've known about all these years that I've lived here. So that was sort of a nice touch. But Dory has a degree in creative writing and in information, library and information science. She now lives up in the Sierras and is working remotely for us, but I rely on her judgment, decision-making, and so on related to the archive. Now, she was responsible when I was looking for someone. Dory was going to go on a sabbatical with her husband, and they were going to the mountains. I needed someone to come in and fill the role in the office and working with me. And it's not an easy process to find an archivist who is interested in an author who's been dead for 40 years, an author whose work is not necessarily read today, a film producer who really didn't produce many films, a songwriter who had fame but not that much fame, a painter whose paintings really were sitting in a office on Van Ness Avenue in San Francisco that really hadn't seen the light of day. They really hadn't been exhibited to any great extent. Anyway, Chris Garcia came on the scene for an interview, and Dory said, I'm not sure you're going to like this guy because he looks a little wild, but I think you're going to want to hear what he has to say. He was born and raised here in Santa Clara, California, by librarians and a firefighter turned limo driver. After graduating from Emerson College with a BA in fine writing, literature and publishing, and an art history and visual studies minor, he joined the Computer Museum in Boston in 1998, before making the transition to what would become the Computer History Museum the following year. Over his 20 years at the museum, he worked in just about every position possible, eventually serving as curator, who brought attention to the world of computer graphics, art, music, and games. Over those years, he was lucky enough to work on several major exhibits, including curating sections in both Revolution, the first 2,000 years of computing, and software. He also worked on and created many small temporary exhibits on everything from popular culture topics to really strange phones. Anyway, his resume goes on, and I'm not going to attempt to read it all. All I can tell you is he's currently working on a book of his own on food, of all things. He's the father of 2 wonderful children. His wife, Vanessa, they live in Boulder Creek. He's a podcaster, and you've heard him speak here today, reading some of Saroyan's work. He is very, very, very committed to this project and is trying to bring it to life along with Dory in ways that it just simply has not taken place until now. It's interesting. This is an interesting adventure. We're here in Silicon Valley. We're here in Saratoga. How many of you knew that William's father, Armina, raised chickens in Campbell, just down the road here? And he passed away here in Campbell. How many of you know where he's buried? Armina.
Present.
He's buried here in San Jose, Oak Hill Cemetery. And if you ever read 74 Routable, that's a book by Saroyan, he writes in his first chapter in there about Arminoc of Biglis, his father. And it's a great chapter. And the father died at a very young age, and of course, William had to go with his entire family, the sisters and brother, to orphanage over in Oakland and lived there for several years until a family member was able to help bring them to Fresno. That 5 years was very instrumental in the development of Saroyan, not only as a person, but as a writer and an artist. But leaving behind for a second and looking at his father, Arminoc. Arminoc sort of led the family to America. He was in eastern part of Turkey just before the massacres, and he was able to leave, came by himself, and eventually brought the family over. We have a project that we're trying to complete one of these days, which is the translation of Arminoc's journal, which he wrote in 1906 of that journal. It's a heartbreaking journal, but it is the truth of what so many Armenian families who had to escape Turkey at that time endured. And we've got this journal, pretty much translated, but more work to be done. But the father, now, you have to listen to this poem. He's written in 1906, before his family's here. And I'm not going to read the whole thing. It starts out, all alone. How sad it is to be alone, living as if held in a fist, writing mournful, endless laments, heartfelt sorrow, their only gist. How sad it is to be alone. May as well sleep beneath the lawn. May as well sleep beneath the lawn. Saroyan's father, Arminak, is buried at Oak Hill Cemetery under the lawn, alone, without even a marker on his plot. That is another project that we've been dreaming about, is putting a absolute important stone on that burial plot. His mother, of course, Takwi, is buried at Cypress Lawn up in Colma with Cosette, but the father remains here in San Jose at Oak Hill Cemetery, just for information. Now, before I introduce our guest speaker, I just want to read something to you. Now, my first archivist was Mary Alexander, and she worked with us in putting together a book of letters between William Saroyan and Archie Menasse, William's cousin. Today we have various members of the Menashian family here, and if you look at the last couple of publications that Dory did online, Place of Places, you're going to see some Archie Menashian watercolors included that are fabulous. Saroyan and Menashian were together continually here on the peninsula, visiting, laughing, gambling, but both absolutely knew how to enjoy life. We had a great opportunity to spend time with both of them growing up. But Saroyan wrote in his book, Here Comes, There Goes You Know Who, something that Mary Alexander put on her desk in front of her computer screen that I just can't put down. And he wrote, there are at least 10 million words of unpublished stuff already on hand here and there. Someday, perhaps a specialist of some kind will run through the stuff, or a little of it, and pick out a few words on the subject of gambling, for instance. In any case, whoever undertakes to mess with my papers has got his work cut out for him. Well, I can tell you this, there was never a statement written by Saroyan, because we have in our collection of goodies hundreds of thousands of words, if not more, of unpublished pieces that he wrote. And believe me, all of it is publishable. It just takes time to go through and work on it. Now, let's see, I think is Philip Scher here? Philip, please stand up. He's with the University of Stanford University. He is the Deputy University Librarian, and he's just taken the position that is going to bring us closer together because they control all of Saroyan's copyrights and his major archive, which we have used several times and continue to always refer to. You'll notice every time we have something published, we always have worked with Stanford in getting that approved and always give them credit for it. So it's very important that any of you are doing that type of research or work, they have a huge archive there. It's just a little cumbersome to get to. But thank you for being with us, and give my regards to everybody. Excuse me for not standing, but I had a fall earlier in the week. I fell off a ladder, and I've hurt my knee.
What's your relationship?
Pardon?
What's your relationship?
Let's see. Well, I'm going to explain the relationship. First of all, I'd like to introduce my brother Bruce Janigian. This is the guy that got me into this mess. He a writer under a, pen name, Avery Mann. So he's also a very talented writer himself. And for years, 1962, 6, 7, I was involved in some stuff at school, and I edited the college literary magazine. And we won first prize in the United States for the best literary magazine on a college campus, San Francisco State College. And I never had the opportunity to really do anything with any of that because our father passed away. But for years, Diane Minasian, Francis Minasian, Vahan Minasian, stand up. These are members of the Minasian family. Let me tell you, we all grew up together. And one thing I knew was that Archie, Uncle Archie, and Willie exchanged letters all the way back to the beginning. 50 years of letter writing. And Bruce introduced me to a collection of letters, my brother Bruce, in Berkeley at Serendipity Books. And he said, I know you're thinking about doing something with these letters. Let me introduce you to Serendipity Books. And if you can secure those letters, maybe you can do something with it. So he left me, and next thing I knew, I was dealing with the owner there, and I bought the letters. But that was only half the story, because Uncle Archie had saved all of Willie's letters. But Willie's collection of Archie letters weren't there. So we had to go and find the letters from Willie to Archie, and Archie to Willie. Anyway, all at Stanford. So we got all of the collection together and we published a book of letters. And that was the beginning of something that at times I wish I never got involved in, but I'm in it now to a degree that I can't turn around. Now, what's my relationship? Our mother was Stella Minasian, Archie Minasian's sister, part of the family. She was Willie's first cousin. Willie's mother, Takwi, and our grandmother, Paransim, were sisters. Okay? There was one other sister in there who ended up being a Bagdasarian, Verkin Bagdasarian, Ross's mother, Paransim, our mother, Willie's mother, Takwi, were all like this. So we all grew up together. And I happened to spend time with William, and so we're cousin. Not first cousin was removed, as I say. Bruce spent time with Willie as his attorney for a period of time. So we were all very, very close. Vahan Minasian here, that's our grandfather's name on my mother's side. He died at a young age like Willie's father. Willie writes in 74, Rue Thibault, if you've heard that book, and if you haven't, I really recommend it. He writes about Vahan Minasian, his namesake, as being the one who really made him realize who the hell he was. So, all things come together, and that's where we are. But now, we're going to move to our guest speaker today, who, is that you? Mark Arax. We for 3 years or so, I know Dory and Mark have been exchanging information. But Mark is a published author, public speaker. He's going to be speaking to us about the importance of Saroyan today and his experience with him. How many of you know Mark's history? Mark, they're really here to listen to you, not listen to me.
You don't need to do an intro either. Let's get right to it. You don't need to do an intro. Let's get right to it, man. We'll get to it.
Okay, let's get right to it. Mark, come on up. You can sit or stand.
The intros are all
Your choice.
They're all bullshit anyhow. I end up writing them and they read them as if they wrote them, and it's just all self-promotion, okay?
I'm gonna take my cane.
Hey, that's dangerous. That's very wobbly. I'm gonna move back a little
Turn on you.
and I'm gonna sit down a little bit. I see some old friends, some that I haven't seen in years, and it's wonderful. You got me out of the San Joaquin Valley, where it was pretty damn buggy and a misery that you get used to. So I'm gonna do a little chat about Saroyan, just 5-10 minutes. I'm gonna do a reading of Saroyan's and a reading of mine, and then I'm gonna have a conversation with my cousin Aris Janigian, who's a novelist who has written 3 books about. He's written 5 books, but 3 of them really celebrate the San Joaquin Valley, and they come right out of the tradition of Saroyan. And so we had a wonderful conversation. During COVID, I came up with this idea. I saw these kids in the first weeks of COVID. They were riding around the streets of Fresno on bicycles. And I could tell that they had never really ridden bicycles before, because they were weaving this way and that way. But after about 2 weeks, I looked outside my window, and these kids who didn't know how to ride a bicycle were all of a sudden riding without their hands on the wheels, okay, on the column, okay. And I thought, wow, they mastered this. I thought, this is there's no one driving around, everything's shut down, and this is I'm being taken back to the 1930s or 40s. This is Saroyan time. So I called up the Valley Public Radio and I said, let's do Saroyan read during this time. So I got these poets and writers at Fresno, and we ended up doing this special 6-part series where we're talking and riffing about Saroyan, finding that he's not just relevant, but super relevant during COVID or any time that's modern times. And then we would read his works, each person. And we had a Latino, we had a Japanese, we had 2 Armenians, we had a Dust Bowl Okie. Everybody was reading Saroyan, and it was a nice thing. So we're going to have Aris and I had a wonderful talk before his reading, and maybe we could duplicate a little bit of that as well. My grandfather, on my father's side, Johnny Hovsepian, was a poet whose pen name was Mark Arax. And Yervan Odian and others were his teachers. These were these great Armenian writers, many of whom died in the genocide. But some of them lived, and there was a bookstore called Babikian's Bookstore in Constantinople in 1918. After the genocide, my grandfather came down from his attic where he was hiding. This is how he outlasted the Turks. He was 15 going into the genocide, 18 coming out of the genocide, hid in this attic, and went to work at Babikian's bookstore, where there was a handful of these great Armenian writers left, and they were trying to find what words were still left to them after this cataclysm, this genocide. The word wasn't around back then, what to call it. Okay, the great tragedy. So they took him under their wings, and they said, Johnny Hovsepian won't do, you got to come up with a pen name. And his first pen name was Aram Aslan. Well, Aslan means lion. My grandfather was about 5'4", 120 pounds. He didn't quite conjure the image of a lion. But there was something about his prose, and I don't know if it was turgid or if it flowed, but it was something about his prose that told him, you kind of write like a river. Now, was the river clogged up or flowing? I don't know. But so he became Aram Arax, named after the mother river that comes down from Mount Aram. That's how he came here. It was his grandfather, Aris's grandfather, that brought him here. He had left, Aris's grandfather had lost everybody in the genocide. and he found his way to the San Joaquin Valley and started writing letters to my grandfather, his nephew, the only real kin left. And he started talking about how we're building a new Armenia here at the foot of these Sierras, okay? And my grandfather had gone up into his attic with these books of French literature, and his plan was to go to Sorbonne. In fact, he'd been accepted to Sorbonne, but he wasn't sure how he was going to pay his way there. And then these letters come. You got to see this new Armenia. Mountains, rivers, grapes the size of jade eggs. I've been told this before. Watermelons. We scoop the meat out and we ride in them down the irrigation canals. Now, this was the hype of California in 1918, 1919, 1920. The big wheat farms of the interior had turned into these fruit orchards where we actually had small growers coming from different parts of the world and growing. And so my grandfather has this choice: Paris, France, or Fresno, California. He takes his grandfather's bait and he arrives. His grandfather is dressed to the nines when he picks him up at the railroad station in Fresno. He's driving a gleaming Model T Ford. My grandfather says the sound of it was like poetry. So what was the sound? Toka, 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 toka. This is the sound. Okay. He takes him to the San Joaquin River, shows him the land, and there at the river, a man named J.C. Faulkner is building this empire of figs and houses. Houses, by the way, that he would not let Armenians live in. He actually, in the real estate covenants, said no blacks, Armenians, or Orientals. There were no blacks in the valley at that time. But I guess any self-respecting exemption on housing would have to encompass blacks. So he took him there, and Faulkner was dynamiting the red hardpan of northwest Fresno to plant figs. One stick of dynamite for every hole. My grandfather said he thought he was back in Constantinople again with the sounds of war. Boom, 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 boom. He was going to plant 10,000 acres of figs. I think he ended up planting 7 or 8. It was the largest planting of figs ever in the world. Calmurna figs, which was a graft of the California fig and the Smyrna fig, which was perfect. It was a perfect metaphor for my grandfather. Okay, Turkey and California together. Faulkner had a problem. He didn't know where to get 600,000 figs. But there was one man who grew them. His name was Mark Arax. He was the fig king. And Mark Arax, being the businessman that he was, sold them those plantings. And so into Fig Garden went Mark Arax's figs. But into the houses of Fig Garden, no Armenian could step. And that was the paradox of Fresno back then. So at some point growing up, around 15, 16, Grandpa and Saroyan were friends. They were a little bit of a half a generation apart, but they were friends. He'd come over to the house for dinner. I got to know him a little bit. I drove him home one night when he was a little hammered. He drank too much Armenian cognac. My grandmother put on this incredible meal, these artichokes that she had marinated herself that he just couldn't stop talking about. As we walked out, he didn't drive, he rode his bicycle, so I drove him there. I was going to drive him home. And he looked up and he said something to the moon. God bless Armenia, he said. Drove him home, and we became, I went to his house over the next couple of years 8 to 10 times. And it was fascinating to see a writer's den. First of all, he wrote standing up. It was a draftsman's table, a royal typewriter. The room was Well, I'm thinking of my room right now as I'm in the middle of a book. It was not much different than that. Clutter everywhere, but organized clutter. In the corner was his shoes, and they were burnished in a very nice polish. I later learned that it was a French polish. And all across were were rocks and shards of glass and twine that he picked up on his bicycle rides through town. I remember asking him, "Why do you collect rocks?" And he said, "Well, look at the rock. I collect the rock because it reminds me that art should be simple." I mean, what's more beautiful than a rock? And you look at it, you see these little etchings that nature's put on it. That was art. In my second year at Fresno State, I was the editor of the newspaper, and I had access to tapes. And Saroyan was kind of cheap. During the day, it was very hot, and it was a tea kettle whistling all the time. He poured himself endless glasses of tea, and he would sweat. And he said, "I need to sweat to write. I'm working." And he said, "But I turn on the air conditioning at night. I sleep when it's cool. I work when it's hot." So he asked me to bring him some tapes from Fresno State. He didn't want to spend the money for the tapes. So I brought him a bunch of tapes. And the next time I went there, he said, "Your tapes have gone to good use." And I said, "What are you doing?" He said, "I'm recording." And he had a tape recorder right there on the ledge by the window into the backyard where he had his fruit trees. And he said, "Listen." So he rewinded the tape and then played it. And it was utter silence. He says, "I'm recording the sounds of night." And he had his window open. The window was open as he was recording it. And I heard this silence, and then I heard a bzzz. It was a fly that was happening to be flying. So this is what a 16 to 18-year-old kid gets in education. He sees this. So I come to him one day, and I said, he says, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm really learning a lot of new words." He says, "What do you mean?" I says, "I've got everything I read, if I come across a word I don't know, I write it down, go into the Webster's dictionary, and define it, and I now have 1,000 new words, 1,000 of them memorized." And he said, "Well, for instance," and I said, "Well, I just put down the word ubiquitous." His face got a little screwy. He said, "Ubiquitous? Where might you use that word?" And I said, "I don't know, but it's in my arsenal." He said, "Go back to my stories and read them." He says, "I use 300 words, that's all, 300. He said something like this. He said, "It's not the words you bring to the page, it's the music you bring to the words." So I don't think I ever caught the word ubiquitous in anything that Saroyan ever wrote. And God help me, I don't think I've ever used the word ubiquitous in any kind of sentence. So this was the schooling. I would ask him, "Can you be married and be a writer?" And he said, "Well, yeah, I was married. In fact, I married the same woman twice." Which I wasn't sure what kind of message he was passing in that. And he said, "There is a loneliness to writing. You have to find a space that's quiet and it's yours. But it's not abject loneliness. It's a loneliness that connects you to the world." I never dared ask him about writing, but what I discovered is at the end of his life, summoning up great courage, he was dying. Every day he stood before that typewriter and wrote his last words. And let me tell you something, they are gorgeous words. I really feel that in those unpublished manuscripts of Saroyan are incredible gems that he's left us. I can't wait for some of those things to be published. Robert Saroyan, given all his limitations, did go through one of the the last things that Saroyan wrote, and came up with a collection called Where the Bones Go. And there's some real beautiful things in this book. How many of you have seen this book? Yeah, I would suggest all of you get it. Here's what Saroyan says was his task. He wrote something like 300,000 words in the last 9-10 months of his life, and he had different titles for it. One was Adios Muchachos. We do not have years, we have days, we have minutes. I have been tagged by disease. I have turned myself over to doctors and to hospitals, and I have consequently been deprived of the days and nights, hours and minutes. Well, I wouldn't know how else to endure the disease, and so that is reason enough for me to come and stand and write every day for a couple of hours. All those minutes, how good. This is a selection called Start with the Trees. How do you write? My answer is I start with the trees and keep on straight ahead. I start with these companions of this place, each fixed into the soil of where it is, and sometime the rock or rocks, and very little else. And after that, the going is not only easy, it is very nearly rollicking. For the tree is a thing of great attachments, and it puts forth all manner of leaves abundantly, and each leaf is the same, but not precisely so that noticing this repetitious imprecision leads to everything else, especially life, especially speculation, and especially the last act of life, the unknown abandonment of tree, branch, twig, leaf, bud, flower, fruit, itself. How do you die, write, live, sicken, heal, despair, rejoice? You are lucky if you don't start at the end, at abstraction. If you start at the beginning, at the specific, the scene, the real, and if you are a writer, you cannot permit yourself to be limited. Although in your art, in your writing, in your tiny microscopic making, you have got to impose limits after all, or you will be able to make nothing. You start with the visible, but really impossible to hold, that gift that is swiftly made commonplace by familiarity, that demonstration of the infinitude of movement. What a loveliness a fire in a fireplace is to the man sitting there watching and listening, and what sweet whisperings of all manner of language come from the wood being consumed by the fire. In fire, we may answer the question of life and art, how you die, how you do, how you live. Now, yeah, it goes on. This is what pains me, that this man is not taught everywhere, that his literature has been lost, really. Thank God what you're doing, Charles. And my cousin and I will talk a little bit about why his words mean so much to us. There is no how to it. How to write, no how do you live, how do you die. If there were, nothing would live in the deep and very delicate chain of life. It is the doing that makes for continuance. It is not the knowing of how the doing is done. The dancer may try to put into choreographic language symbols and signs of his muscle or her muscle and skill so that others may dance that way again. But it doesn't seem to work. He who danced, he who saw him dance, she who saw her dance, he who danced with her and watched with him and studied and remembered what had been seen, he and she and they dancing and dancing to the manuscript of instruction. They dance, but it isn't the same. Perhaps it is better even, or might become better, but it is not the same. There is always only one of each, always, and two may be desirable, but it is impossible. There is a different breath in every breather, a writer writes. And if he begins by remembering a tree in the backyard, that is solely to permit him gradually to reach the piano in the parlor upon which rests the photograph of the kid brother killed in war. And so I wrote it, starting with the old English walnut tree, which every year literally thousands of the magnificent hard fruit, which when you remove the black casing, which dried and could be made to crumble away to the grooved shell, which then you could break with a hammer, and then behold, as a design of intricate engineering, of art, of construction, the hardwood slick and light brown in its convolutions, in which the meat of the nut, as it is called, had ripened to a substance with the most subtle and satisfying flavor implanted into anything that creatures, including human beings and small boys like Henry and Willie, as my brother and I were referred to by other members of the family and the neighborhood, and still are, thank God, could remove from the shell and put into the mouth and taste and chew and swallow and never suspect that indeed this is how we do, how we live, how we die, how we write, how we read. It's beautiful. I didn't start with the tree in this book. I started with the highway, 99, because it is a thing of great attachments to. Boy, I hesitate to read my words in the wake of that, but I will. On a summer day in the San Joaquin Valley, 101 in the shade, I merge onto Highway 99 past downtown Fresno and steer through the vibrations of heat. I'm headed to the valley's deep south, to a little farm worker town in a far corner of Kern County called Lost Hills. This is where the biggest farmer in America, the one whose mad plantings of almonds and pistachios have triggered California's nut rush, keeps on growing, no matter drought or flood. He doesn't live in Lost Hills. He lives in Beverly Hills. How has he managed to outwit nature for so long? The GPS tells me to take Interstate 5, the fastest road through the belly of the state, but I'm partial to Highway 99, the old road that brought the Okies and Mexicans to the fields and deposited a twang on my Armenian tongue. 99 runs 2 lanes here, 3 lanes there, through miles of agriculture broken every 20 minutes by fast food, gas station, and cheap motel. Tracks of houses, California's last affordable dream, civilized 3 or 4 exits, and then it's back to the open road, splattered with the guts and feathers of chickens that jumped ship on the slaughterhouse drive. Pink and white oleanders divide the highway, and every third vehicle that whooshes by is a big rig. More often than not, it is hauling away some piece of the valley's unbroken bounty. The harvest begins in January with one type of mandarin and ends in December with another type of mandarin, and in between comes everything in your supermarket produce and dairy aisle except for bananas and mangoes. though the farmers here are working on the tropical tea. I stick to the left lane and stay ahead of the pack. The big rig drivers are cranky two-ways, and the farm workers in their last leg vans are half asleep. 99 is the deadliest highway in America, deadly in the rush of harvest, deadly in the quiet of fog, deadly in the blur of Saturday nights when the field work is done and the beer drinking becomes a second humiliation. 20 miles outside Fresno, I cross the Kings, the river that irrigates more farmland than any other river here. The Kings is bone dry as usual. To find its flow, I'd have to go looking in 1,000 irrigation ditches in the fields beyond. There's a mountain range to my left and a mountain range to my right, and in between a plain flatter than Kansas where crop and sky meet. One of the most dramatic alterations of the Earth's surface in human history took place here. The hillocks that existed back in Yokan Indian days were flattened by a hunk of metal called the Fresno scraper. Every river busting out of the Sierra was bent sideways, if not backward, by a bulwark of ditches, levees, canals, and dams. The farmer corralled the snowmelt and erased the valley, its desert and marsh. He leveled its hog wallows, denuded its salt brush, and killed the last of its Mustang antelope and Tule elk. He emptied the sky of tens of millions of geese and drained the 800 square miles of Tulare Lake dry. He did this first in the name of wheat, then beef, milk, raisins, cotton, and nuts. Once he finished grabbing the flow of the 5 rivers that ran across the plain, he used his turbine pumps to seize the water beneath the ground. As he bled the aquifer dry, he called on the government to bring him an even mightier river from afar. Down the great aqueduct, by freight of politics and gravity, came the excess waters of the Sacramento River. The farmer commanded the distant flow. The more water he took, the more crops he planted. And the more crops he planted, the more water he needed to plant more crops, and on and on. 1 million acres of the valley floor, greater than the size of Rhode Island, are now covered in almond trees. I pity the outsider trying to make sense of it. My grandfather, a survivor of the Armenian genocide, traveled 7,000 miles by ship and train in 1920 to find out if his uncle's exhortation, "The grapes here are the size of jade eggs," was true. My father, born in a vineyard outside Fresno, was a raisin grower before he became a bar owner. I grew up in the suburbs, where our playgrounds were named after the pioneers of fruit, and irrigation canals shot through our neighborhoods to farms we did not know. For half my life, I never stopped to wonder how much was magic, how much was plunder. I'd like to invite my cousin Aris up here. We'll have a little discussion and then we'll open it up to questions. Okay. He's every bit the student of Saroyan that I am. And we have some ideas for trying to bring Saroyan back. One of them is to get a Library of America edition finally. I mean, there are B-list writers who have Library of America editions now. Saroyan is left off those lists. Okay, cuz.
Hey, brother.
So,
Get together.
yeah, sure.
Here's the plate.
Thank you, brother. So, we were talking on the way here about Saroyan, what he meant to us, and I wish you guys we created that conversation, but we'll try to do it. You've been reading a lot of Saroyan again. I have too. And I think as older men, we read him as kids. Summer of the, Beautiful White Horse, the Pomegranate Trees. I mean, these are epic stories that really, as I return to them, you can dismiss them sometimes as simple, but like The Rock, they're not simple at all. They're myths. I mean, this man's writing myths. Okay. So, tell me why you've come back to Saroyan again and what you're seeing, what he's saying to you now that you didn't get as a kid.
Saroyan was I grew up at 3440 El Monte Way, and his childhood home was 3220 or something. So we both grew up in Old Armenian Town. So he was.
Can you hear Aris? Sorry about it.
Excuse me.
We were supposed to have a mic, but it's all right. We got a wobbly table instead.
I said that I had grown up at 3440 El Monte Way in Fresno. That was Old Armenian Town. And Bill's first home was just down the block from us. So he imbued my life as a child. His imagination seemed to be my imagination. His Arab stories, I felt I could have written, and I did live it to a degree. So he was my implicit mentor. I saw him on occasion. I didn't have the opportunity to visit with him like Mark did, but he was the basis for my, I think, will and hope to be a writer. I think that Mark's asking how my feelings about him have changed. It have, to a degree, but maybe deepened awareness or hunches I had when I was younger. One of the aspects of Saroyan's mind, imagination, and lyricism that I think hasn't been remarked on is I believe that Saroyan thought in Armenian and wrote in English. I think that accounts for this very strange innocence, directness, elementalness of his writing. The Armenian language is one of the most ancient existing languages in the world. Some scholars have even hypothesized that it is its own branch, like the Basque language. It's that ancient. Our words are essentially rooted in nature. They're rooted in the sounds of the earth. Our word for water is jur.
Yeah.
I mean, you could see it burbling out of a rock. You could feel it on your tongue. Apple, khanzor. I mean, that you're biting into an apple. I mean, these aren't abstractions. These are words that were born at the moment that they were born. You could go on and on with Armenian words like this. Chish. Pissing.
Sheesh.
Yeah, it just goes on and on like this. So I had a hunch about this when I was younger, but as I read more and more of Bill's work, I'm more convinced that early language was embedded in his mind, in his brain structure virtually. And as was the Armenian kind of way of going in the world. He was a peasant. He was a farm boy, basically. Robust, ebullient, hopeful, I think genuinely sweet nature. There's a lot of bullshit written about him. But if you read the letters between Archie and Bill, I've read through it, Charles' extraordinary collection. The way that he talks to his cousin with such generosity and sweetness back and forth, never a bitter word. They get in bad situations. Poor Archie's struggling. You know, Bill's struggling. They're just giving each other encouragement. There's always hope and a sense of, I think, classic kind of Armenian, just generosity of heart. I don't know, maybe, you know, if you're not an Armenian, you might think I'm bullshitting you here. But I think that is part of our spirit, which has allowed us to endure to this day. So I think that's one observation, Mark, that has deepened with time. And you could certainly find this in this extraordinary collection.
So we try to figure out why the critics went bad on him. What you know, this notion that he was sentimental. I remember him telling me that what is a writer if not being sentimental? You know, this notion that you couldn't show feeling. This guy's writing about the only question that really matters. How do we live and how do we die? And how do we come to terms with all the stuff in between? All the rest of it is noise. And the noise, he just gets rid of the noise. And he doesn't, and you know, when you read his novels, was he a natural novelist? No, because he was impatient. A novel and a long book of nonfiction, to write them in that way, it takes tremendous patience. About his was boom, an energy, a burst, cutting a vein and letting it bleed out. He would come back. This notion that he never edited his stuff is wrong. He was actually a really good editor, but he was trying to capture a moment with that energy, and so the critics criticize him because his novels, you know, didn't have a character development in the right way or whatever. It doesn't matter. This guy laid down on the page not only what we've read, but the stuff we haven't read. That is just genius stuff.
Yeah, I think that anybody who underestimates Saroyan really hasn't read it. That's all I can say. He is one of our great American writers. There's no doubt about it. He was a natural too. I mean, who's that talented at 25? And no, people don't recognize that Saroyan's early stories were considered avant-garde. I mean, everybody, all the beat poets read him. Henry Miller read him. Everybody that really who mattered to our 20th century scene studied Saroyan. They knew his work. He was a Walt Whitman-esque writer. He wrote in the American vein, a natural voice, the cadence of jazz, the images of just life churning by. He was a great American writer. Why they turned against him? Lots of speculation, but they did. The critics left him for dead, basically, at a certain point.
Who's the they?
These would be literary critics, academics.
New York.
The New York establishment, yeah, mostly the New York establishment. But the West Coast never makes anybody as a literary figure. So, you know, they have a lock on that. Even to this day, they have a lock on that scene. But it's a difficult question to answer, and I'm not going to claim I can nail it. But a couple things to think about is literary criticism. You know, there began this thing called literary critics. You know, there were the guys who did the reviews of the books always. You know, in the San Francisco Chronicle and the New York Times. Those guys. But then there began these literary critics. These are very, you know, smart people in places like Stanford, and places like, you know, in Columbia, and they were out for fodder for their criticism. They're the ones who needed stuff that no one else understood in order to make a livelihood. So they were drawn towards writers whose works was obscure and could show off their particular genius in making it available to the masses. Joyce is the kind of most, you know, the obvious example of that, but even to a degree Faulkner and Hemingway was not in that camp, by the way. But they began to be attracted to writers of this type. Saroyan did not make them happy because Saroyan didn't give a shit. He really didn't. He didn't even like those people. He was writing to you and me, and I believe he thought that if you needed a critic as a middle person, you weren't writing. And so I think that's one thing I would ask people to think about. He was an optimist. You know, he never got into huge existential issues or deep philosophical thought. He does, but that's not the root of his writing. He's not studying the philosophy and then making a literary model of that philosophy, which some writers do to this day. He had ideas about life, but they came from his natural, observations. So he didn't appeal to people who wanted to think of writing as this high philosophical endeavor. No, he was just writing the way that people live, and that became, in the way people live is with the degree of optimism, or they should live with the degree of optimism and joy, and that was a turnoff, especially to the people after the Second World War and the horrors of Nazi Germany.
Yep.
And they began to turn away from him at that moment, thinking he was naive. In fact, he wasn't naive. They never processed the fact that this man observed his own people go through a genocide. I mean, he saw those genocide survivors flood into Fresno, and everybody knew. In fact, my thinking is that he had actually gone through it before everybody else had gone through it. And so he processed it and decided to write in spite of that.
I think let's questions.
Yeah, I'm trying to place the two of you in the time that because Saroyan was alive, he'd be about 100 years old today, wouldn't he?
Yeah.
So how old were you guys when you were interacting with him?
Well, I was 16, 17.
You?
10?
16?
10.
Now, had he already gone to Paris and come back?
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah, no. This isn't.
Well,
I
he
met
already-
Saroyan in his mid 60s, late 60s. He died in 72, right? So yeah, and I saw him. After he died,
So
yeah.
you saw him after Paris?
he would go back and
He'd
forth.
go back and forth.
Yeah,
I see.
yeah, he'd be back and forth. I took care of his fruit trees when he was gone. It was just, we lived in these side-by-side track houses on Griffith Way in Fresno. If you looked up the address, it was under the name Garaganian, okay? In other words, it wasn't Saroyan. That was his mother's maiden name, the Garaganian family. And then their characters in My Name is Arm, too. Yes.
You gave the address of where he's at downtown. I forgot where that's at. That's south of Ventura, isn't it?
That's just one block south of Ventura.
One block south of Ventura.
There's a little plaque on that house now.
Yeah. A house or is a house turned down?
It's there.
Oh,
It was for sale about 10 years ago. I don't know what happened about it.
You're talking about West Griffith?
No, El Monte Way.
Oh.
West Griffith has been sold.
That was sold
It's got a
recently,
plaque
too.
on it. Now it's been turned into a museum. I've never been there. A Soviet Armenian, very wealthy man, bought one of the houses, and they've got what's the thing where the image of Saroyan comes up as real?
Hologram.
Yeah. It's a little gimmicky. I wish they would have kind of recreated that whole clutter in there, but I don't know that it's well promoted. The stuff you're doing, I was interested, the 225, 300,000 words of manuscript you have, are those duplicative of what Stanford has, or are they different?
Some may be duplicates, but most are different.
Different, okay. Yes, questions?
I met Saroyan in 1974. He's been organized in NGI, the Armenian camp, and he one day
He's talking about a visit that Saroyan made to Lebanon. I didn't know that he went there.
When he came to Antioch, the Armenian town, everybody was welcoming him. He grabbed his big drum, one of the drummers, and started banging at the drum, started dancing like crazy. So we were Boy Scouts, young kids, and it just took us away. He stayed there a couple of 2-3 nights, and everybody was there. Tons of thousands of people. So, quite a scene.
That's beautiful.
My question is, could you bring to the audience, there was an encounter between him and Hemingway in Paris, or they had a fist fight or something?
Yeah.
I don't think they got to this far.
Well, they came close. They came close to this fighting. It was Hemingway said something smart about Saroyan's writing. We'll be here long after that Armenian's gone, or something like that. Just a hot shot. And then he took a shot at something about his literature being stilted or something. They saw in the bar, and they almost. He called. I think he called him the Armenian or something. Is that story in here? No. Oh. Here's the Daring Young Men, the literary feud between Saroyan and Hemingway. Dory's done this. Okay. Dory, you should answer that question. You got to listen to Dory's stuff. I just listened to her piece on the Armenian Presbyterian Church and its ties to Saroyan, and it's woven into the fabric of Fresno and where it came from. She's done a great job of mixing history and everything else. Really, really good stuff.
Was that fight at Cafe de la Paix?
Dory, where was
Come here, Dory.
That sounds right.
Because that cafe is still there.
They got into a few kerfuffles. Once in London
Take your mask off.
around during World War II. Hemingway was a war correspondent, and Saroyan was serving. And so they had some words there, and then again in Paris. I think it was, what's that? It was, I'm trying to remember, it's a hotel, I think, the hotel bar.
Okay.
But yeah, it's in here, this is at the front. The whole story of their relationship from 1935 up until Hemingway died, pretty much. It's all noted in here, and all of that we know of, all their interactions, and sometimes they were friendly, and other times they were, downright disdainful of each other. But no one has ever proven that they got into an actual fist fight. But some people claim they did, and that's in here too. So.
If you're interested in getting a copy of that, just leave your name in front. We only brought 5 or 6 copies with us, but she did an extraordinary job on this, and it was such a great job that I decided to have it printed.
Yeah, nice.
And this was one item that we had sent up to Stanford and never got a response on, but we went ahead and did it anyway. Another one we did was my favorite story of Saroyan's out of a publication, Inhale and Exhale. It was published in England, called Ben. And this one, I would have to say, is a piece of genius, written far beyond his time or anyone's time. Have you ever heard of this story?
It's from Inhale Exhale? It's from Inhale Exhale.
Inhale, Exhale. This is from the British version.
It wasn't in the American version?
Well,
It's called 666 in the.
Okay, 666. Yeah.
anyway,
Yeah.
Stanford is recognized here because this was approved. We include some Armenian imagery on here and the front and back of the numbers. But anyway, if you're interested in one of those, let Chris know. Do we have any other questions?
Yeah, I kind of, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Ma'am?
My ancestors were German Russians, so I know a little bit about those.
Olga Germans, yes.
And I have come to appreciate the Armenian congregations much more as I've been older and read more. But my question for you is very simple. Did that school in Fresno get named after the Armenian professor?
It did. We got Faulkner's name wiped off and Roger's appearing. My father's best friend was Tommy Bayless, Volga German. The Volga Germans and the Armenians were pretty, there was a lot of acrimony between them. They lived right on, the railroad tracks separated them. And they were both two proud cultures. The Volga Germans, being German, were able to kind of, get involved in Fresno life, be accepted in a way that the Armenians weren't. So there was some animosity there too. But yeah, a lot of close friendships between Volga Germans and Armenians in spite of those tensions. Yeah. Yes, there's a couple more. Yes.
I understand that the majority of Saroyan's collections are at Stanford or Berkeley, and there was some...
No, they were initially at Berkeley, and then there was a whole feud. I wrote a story about that in the LA Times years ago. Saratoga was a Stanford guy, right? Yeah. Got it over to Stanford. Yeah, I happen to be a judge in the Saroyan International Writing Prize every 2 years. So Stanford's done a great job with that. But yeah, I love to see some of his. I've got this idea of going into Saroyan's pile because he left behind a kind of pile that really no writer of the 20th century did. I mean, Saroyan had some real idiosyncrasies, and we've talked about these. He would all the rocks, twine, glass, but he would when he ate a can of green beans, for instance, he would take the label off. On the back of it, he would say green beans, 4/12/74, eaten at 6 p.m. And he's a beauty. And our theory is that his obsession with death and dying, that he might have been just collecting all these kind of artifacts of living, okay, and building a wall to kind of keep death on the other side of it. Okay? We talked about that.
That's a good news.
Yeah. But yeah, it's there. I want to go into that pile. There's some diary. When I would go visit him, he would make diary entries. I want to see what those were. Then my grandfather and he traded letters. So maybe if I get enough years, I'll do a book called Saroyan's Pile. And kind of look into that and using that as a way to come back to my grandfather and his brother's story. My grandfather was a poet. His brother, Harry Arax, killed a police officer in Long Beach in the 1930s and spent most of his life in San Quentin. So when he got out, he came to live with us. And let me tell you, this guy was something. So we had a poet and a killer come out of the same time. So this is the Armenian story, yes.
I've got to tell the story of how...
Come up here, Bruce.
Come on, we did this very Armenian style. I was supposed to kind of like lecture you guys. No way. My cousin after we got here, go ahead.
This is a street because I was chairing the Agricultural and Labor Relations Board in Sacramento, and I get a call from a fellow saying he's about to do a hit piece on me and the board. And I said, "Who are you?" And he said his name was Mark Arax. And I said, "Wait a minute, Arax? Do you know that I think I said grandfather, was great uncle, Harry Arax, was defended by my great uncle Aris Janigian, who kept him from the gas chamber.
He did, man.
And you wouldn't be here if it wasn't for my great uncle." And Mark said, we're not running the story.
I don't know if I ever took a shortcut on anything like that. But Aram, the lawyer, who dressed in all white for my uncle's murder trial, and I have this in my first book, In My Father's Name. He concocted the most incredible closing statement. First of all, he dressed in all white, and he said that Harry Arax was a victim. Now, we didn't have the word post-traumatic stress disorder, but he basically put together an entire closing argument saying that he, as an Armenian growing up in Constantinople, had seen the gendarmes do such things to the Armenians that he was forever scarred. And so when he was in Long Beach and the police officer was coming up the stairs to collect on a bad debt that Harry had made good, Harry immediately visualized the gendarmes in Turkey and had no choice but to fire 3 times.
Absolutely plausible.
Yes. Harry was saved from the gallows. Everybody in Long Beach was really upset. And he ended up going into San Quentin. And when he came out, he told me such stories. I had him write half his life story. I got it still on him. So yeah, this is Armenian town.
We heard my Uncle Arm's closing argument no less than 50 times.
Are you kidding?
I am the god of vengeance, and all he purposely selected a jury that were fundamentalist Christians. And he told them that only the Lord can take a life. And anyway, he repeated that closing argument to us ad nauseum. So when I heard your name, Arax, that was enough.
I didn't know that, and if I ever get around to writing Saroyan's Pile, that story and your recollection of what was told will be in it. Okay? I mean, we've got to get some more years.
Yeah. Isn't that the same argument they used in the trial in Berlin about that Armenian they killed in Turkey?
Yeah.
They
Part of it,
used
yeah.
the same logic.
Yeah.
But that was defensible. That argument was defensible.
Yeah, he was an actual victim that was there. He was
Right.
killing,
Right.
that was Solomon Talarian who
Yeah,
killed
yeah.
Talat Pasha. This is Harry Arax killing a Long Beach police officer. Anyhow, anything else?
Very good.
I met Saroyan one time at the Fresno Convention Center. There was a boxing match, and my brother was there, and he was taking the famous writers' school from correspondence school from William by Bennett Cerf.
Yeah.
Saroyan was there, and my brother asked him, "What do you think of the famous writers' school?" And Saroyan says, "Fuck the famous writers' school." And my brother said, "Well, they blue pencil your work." He says, "Blue pencil your own work." He says, "What you need is a school for discipline." And
That's
and then-
beautiful.
Then my mother knew him, and then he wrote in a book, if you want to be Rose's good boy, Frank, if you want to be a writer, read the great writers.
That's true. That's true.
Okay.
Anyhow, this has been a real delight.
I'd like to get some group pictures, if that's okay.
Yeah, I guess. I'm not much
Would you
on
mind
pictures.
if you-
No, we can.
Very good.